Hi everybody, it's Laura Judah with Time and Destiny, and I'm here to continue what we started talking about last week, looking at what is God saying about Passover and the plagues this year in 2020. I believe we're in a new era now, and God has a very different kind of Passover for us. Many of God's people are on board with Passover, and they understand the significance of the Passover lamb and the connection to Jesus, that the spring feasts were a picture of Jesus's first coming. But I believe that we're in a year unlike any other, that God is going to do some very amazing things this year because we have stepped into a new time and because God has been, I would call it like a warm-up over the past decade or so, that God has been ramping up and he's been drawing more and more people into an understanding of the feasts. And I think that it was for this very reason, that he wanted to get more people on board with understanding his feasts so that we would be ready this year in 2020 as he begins really pouring out his power and demonstrating himself in a whole new way. And there's a whole nother segment of the body of Christ that really hasn't been on board with the feasts, but now's the time to get on board. So it's my goal through these series of videos that I'm doing right now is to try to help in that process, to bring some understanding to the feasts of God and to help people understand what's really happening in this particular year. Before I dig into the message, I just want to mention that I prepared this lap book for use with my own children years ago. It's called From Plagues to Passover, and it's a way to work with your kids through this. It provides the back up the understanding. It tells you what scriptures to read, and then it gives a little explanation of what those scriptures are for, and it provides all of this in a lap book format so the kids can have their little cutouts and they can make their notes in these cutout pieces. There's over 30 pieces of cutouts in there, and it is available on my website called timeanddestiny.com. If you're interested, and if what you hear here in this message kind of piques your curiosity or it makes you want to share this information with your kids, this is a really good way to do it through that lap book. So be sure to look for it on timeanddestiny.com in our store. Okay, so last Friday when we got together, I talked about Moses and the just taking a look at Moses' life, looking at the way the Lord dealt with Moses, bringing him up in a very difficult generation when Pharaoh was wanting to kill off the babies, and how Moses' mother had to deal with some things that might have seemed pretty unexpected at that time. Lots of questions about the way that Moses was brought up by Pharaoh's daughter and why God would have him brought up the way he was. But he was brought up just exactly the way God wanted him to be brought up, so that he would have what he needed and he would have an understanding of Pharaoh and his palace and the royalty that existed in that religious system, so that when the day came, he would be fully equipped to deal with going back to actually confront the Pharaoh at that time. We don't always understand God's ways, but that's okay. We just need to be obedient to that. So today I'm going to carry on with when God was giving Moses his instructions, he wanted Pharaoh to be very clear about who he was and the reason why he was going to bring these plagues on the land. And he wanted Moses to be completely confident, even though Moses' self-confidence had gone away. He wanted Moses and Aaron to be very confident of God's power working through them. And so one of the things that Moses said, well, my own people don't even want to listen to me. Why would I think Pharaoh would listen to me? And God pretty much told him, well, don't worry about it because Pharaoh's not going to listen to you. He's going to harden his heart, but I still want you to communicate my message. And so this was what God told Moses, the first thing that he should say to Pharaoh. We find this in Exodus chapter 4, verses 22 and 23. The Lord said, "Tell Pharaoh, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me. But you have refused to let him go, so behold, I will kill your firstborn." That was the introduction that Moses was to give Pharaoh, letting him know that Israel was God's firstborn son. And I'm mentioning this now because as we move on through the story, we know that eventually Jesus comes and he is really what's being represented in this story. He is God's firstborn, and we are the first fruits of Jesus. We are a form of the firstborn also. So these things are all going to tie together as we go through this story. The next thing that happens also in chapter 4 is that before Moses could fully step into his assignment, he had been given an order to circumcise him and his family. That was given throughout all the Hebrew lines. They were supposed to circumcise themselves. And Moses went on. He was going to go on his march to meet Pharaoh, and he hadn't done that yet. And his wife, who wasn't even a Hebrew, called him out on it. And she said, no, we're not going into that assignment until we first go through circumcision. And she confronted him about that and forced them to circumcise. Now, the thing that's important about that is the circumcision was an outward act. And in the flesh, it was a part of the foreskin, a place where a reproductive organ, and a place where disease or infection could grow. And so what they were doing through that was preventing disease and infection from reproducing not only in the person but in their family line. And this is important for us because the Lord told us that our form of circumcision is not that. Our form of circumcision is being set apart with the Lord through the blood of Jesus and circumcising our own heart, willingly offering ourselves to the Lord and asking Him to cleanse us. And that is so important to us before we try to step into our assignment, that we have circumcised our own heart and that we have given the Lord free rein to expose and to eliminate places in our own life that may be infectious or disease-ridden, so to speak. Like we don't want to go in, we can't go into the enemy's camp with known sin on us, walking in an impure heart before the Lord, because that gives the devil a foothold to our lives, and not only to us but to our entire family. So just bringing this into the present day, before we step into our assignments, we must be sure that we go through a sanctification process where we allow the Lord to examine us and to expose things in our life that need to be dealt with. And I believe that is part of what we're going through right at this moment. We are in this time of a divine pause where God has called us to come and be set apart, to sit with Him, to let Him speak to us, and to clean house. We're also in the month of spring cleaning, very significant on God's calendar, that before they left to go out into the wilderness even, or during that process of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, as we begin to move into this whole Passover theme, that was about cleaning their house. It was about getting rid of all sin. And so this is the time that we're in right now. Be sure that you are spending time with the Lord and asking Him, what needs to be separated out of your life so that you can be more separated unto him, and be cleaned out so that you are fully ready to step into your assignment as we come to Passover and move beyond that. The next thing is that Moses and Aaron went to the leaders of the Israelites, and they were telling them, look, the Lord has seen your plight. He's heard your cries. You've been slaves in Egypt. He's heard you. He's going to come down. He's going to do something miraculous on your behalf. And the Bible tells us that when Moses and Aaron told these leaders that, and Aaron also demonstrated with his staff how his staff could turn into a snake, and that the Lord had given them power and authority through that staff. It says that they believed, the Israelite leaders believed what Moses and Aaron said. And when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them, that he had seen their affliction, they bowed low and they worshiped. So this is saying to us that they received the words of the prophets. They received the words of Moses and Aaron. They believed what God was saying, and they accepted that, and they agreed to participate with the Lord in that process. That was their initial reaction. Unfortunately, as soon as Moses and Aaron started to go out and speak to Pharaoh, Pharaoh got angry, and he made life worse for the Israelites. They started to take their supplies away so that they couldn't make as many bricks, and they got more and more burdened in their jobs. And we've seen how over the last couple years, we've been ramping up to this point. There's been more and more persecution on God's people as we move closer and closer to this time frame that we're in now. The persecution from the world system has gotten a lot greater in the last few years, as I'm sure everyone can attest to. So then it left them feeling confused, and they got mad. They got angry at Moses. They, of course, wanted to find who can we blame, and the only one they could blame was Moses. They got angry at him, and it's kind of like what we see happen around us. We get burdened with stuff we don't understand, and we start looking for who can we blame. We can blame our president. We can blame each other. We can blame our religious leaders. But what we need to do is go to God with our complaints. And we need to ask him, and we need to continue to trust and believe that what he originally said, just like when the disciples were in the boat with Jesus, we're going to the other side. When God says we're going to do something, or he's going to do something, he's true to his word. So they bombarded Moses so badly with their complaints, and they were so much on his case that even Moses had to go back and say, God, what are you doing? You know, I thought you sent me to be a deliverer, and look what's happened to the people. But God's response was not, okay, I'm going to get them out of this right away. What God said was, I want them, I'm going to make myself known. He said, I established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the promised land, and tell them that I am. Tell them that I am. And so what he was saying was, I am who they need me to be in every moment. Cry out to me, and I will be who you need me to be. That I am going to deliver them from their burdens, and that I am going to redeem them. And he says, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. So he's saying, you're going to see both. You're going to see my redemption, but you're also going to see my judgments. And don't be alarmed when you see these things, because this is what I'm doing, and you need to just hang in there with me. So again, it's a really good parallel for where we are today. We've been crying out. People of God have been crying out. People all over the world have been crying out because there has been a great deal of suffering. And I feel very confident that God has risen up and said, I see you. I know the suffering that you've been through. He knows it way more than we do. He knows the root and the core of evil that is in our land far better than we do. He is going to the root, and he is going to deal with the root of things. He's not going to just deal with the surface level. He's not going to just pick a few of us up out of our troubles and make it better. He is going to the root, and he is going to deliver nations from an oppression that evil has held over the globe. And it may be uncomfortable at times. It may look like things aren't going that way, but I'm promising you that God is doing something extremely amazing in this hour, and we have got to just trust him in this. So let's take a quick look today now at the plagues. As part of the lap book that I made, I had drawn out a chart that shows similarities and patterns in all of the 10 plagues. And so there's a pattern of 3. The first 3 plagues are somewhat similar. They're rather mild in intensity. The second 3 set of plagues ramp up their level of intensity. And by the time you get to the last, the plagues 7, 8, and 9, they're very intense until we get to the 10th one, which of course is the killing of the firstborn. And so we're going to look at these in the sets of 3. Today we're going to look at 1 through 3. The first one is the plague of blood. Now, the Nile River was the source of life to Egypt. In their economy and in their world system, it was essential for food and for water. And they had 2 gods associated with the Nile, Happy and Noom, or Khnum. And they were viewed as the source and sustainer of life. The Egyptians worshiped them as the sustainers of life. And they were, as I said, extremely important. When Moses and Aaron came to Pharaoh and told him that he needed to let God's people go, and he said no, then Moses said, well, okay, now Aaron's going to strike the Nile, and it's going to turn to blood. So your water source is going to be defiled. Well, Pharaoh didn't seem to be fazed by that, and he turned to his magicians, and he instructed them to perform of their magic arts. And even though Aaron's staff had turned the Nile to blood and their water source, the magicians were able to duplicate that and to bring even more blood into the water pots and everything that was water, liquid anywhere. But they weren't able to reverse it. Only Moses and Aaron were able to reverse that curse. So Pharaoh didn't pay that much attention to it. He said, okay, and not really caring that this was going to supremely affect his economy and the people that he was supposed to be ruling over. And so his response was that he would ask Moses and Aaron to take it away, but in the meantime, he really wasn't very concerned about the people. And we can kind of liken this to the way our government has operated. There may have been hardships brought on the land, but as long as it didn't touch them too much, it didn't affect their source of supply, they didn't care that much about us as people. They only cared about themselves. But I want you to think for a moment about the people that were affected by this. Being part of their economic system, how were these people going to eat? How were these people going to drink? What were they going to do? And if if your source gets contaminated or it dries up, what are you going to do? Like, this is how we can relate to what they were going through. We don't have that kind of agricultural society where we look to our rivers and we would say, well, we've got water stored up in tanks and we've got different kinds of systems. But if our water started to get contaminated, if our food supply starts to go short, like we've seen in the last couple weeks, if our paychecks dry up, what is our reaction? Can we comfortably go to God and say, I fully trust you to take care of me? Or is the first thing that we're doing looking for who we can blame and looking to the government for, how are you going to take care of us now? How many of us are crying out, we need our stimulus checks. We need these economic stimulus things that the government is going to pass out in order to be our supplier right now. We have to really question ourselves and begin to ask, how much can I really trust God when things get bad? When I don't have what I need, when my resources and the things that I depend on are starting to dry up, am I really trusting God or am I trusting in other sources? And the reason that the Lord wants us to deal with this is because He knows what's coming. And He knows that we may face some hardships in the future. But if we can trust God in those hardships, we're going to be able to go through those times in peace in our hearts, and we're going to be able to be there for other people who don't have peace. And we're going to be able to show them God is the one that we need to trust. Not the government, not other resources, not savings that we might have stored up. It's God and God alone. So in this time, ask Holy Spirit to reveal any mindsets that are opposing God in this area of trusting for our source and our supply. The second plague had to do with frogs. And the Nile River would flood and frogs would appear. And this was a guarantee of a good harvest for the Egyptian people. Frogs were a sign of fertility, and they were revered by the Egyptian people. It was actually punishable by death if any Egyptian killed a frog. They deified the frog, and they actually had a frog goddess whose name was Heket. And she was believed to be a symbol of resurrection and fertility. Now, Moses gave Pharaoh a warning before this plague was brought on Egypt. And he once again told Pharaoh, you need to let God's people go. And he told him that if he did not, these frogs would come upon the land. And Pharaoh, again, pretty much disregarded what Moses had to say. So Aaron stretched out his rod over the streams and the pools, and frogs began to come in abundance. Now, they loved frogs, they revered them, but there can also become a point when you get too much of a good thing. And that's where these people were at. There were frogs everywhere. And Moses told them, you're going to have frogs in your beds. You're going to have frogs in your kitchens. You're going to have frogs all over your houses. And you're going to have frogs jumping all over you. And now they had way more frogs than they could have ever wanted. So it wasn't a good thing. And even though the magicians, once again, were able to duplicate the creation of frogs, they could not reverse that. They had to rely on Moses and Aaron to reverse that curse. And Moses gave Pharaoh the choice, when do you want this to happen? And Pharaoh said, well, tomorrow. So Moses honored what he said. He asked the Lord to remove the curse of the frogs, but it didn't remove the frogs. They just died. And now they had loads of dead frogs, that were going to bring a huge stench across the land to continue to remind them of their disobedience and the fact that their god, their goddess of frogs, was completely unable to deliver them from this plague. So it's kind of reminds me also of when the Israelites were in the desert and they were complaining, and the Lord brought them so much quail that they had more than they could eat. And we need to be careful that when we start crying out to God, that we aren't acting like temper throwing toddlers, demanding what we want, because sometimes the Lord will give us more than what we really need, and it becomes more of a burden than a blessing. The third plague was the plague of gnats, and this was the gnats were something that God did not announce. He did not tell Moses to go and announce to Pharaoh this time that these gnats were going to come upon their land. There was an Egyptian god named Geb, and he was believed to be the god of the earth. And they believed that when Geb laughed, that's what created earthquakes. And so this plague would be showing that their god, called Geb, was not able to control this sudden onset of gnats in their land. And the reason that this became so important was because the gnats came upon the people, and they were biting the people, and they were creating little stings that were very painful to their skin. Now, these were irritating all the people and all the livestock, bringing on probably disease and impurity. It also brought these gnats upon their priests, who prided themselves upon their purity. They would wash themselves through their ceremonial traditions, and they went to great lengths to keep their bodies clean, to keep their clothes clean. But with all these bites on them, they were impure. And there was no way that they could reverse that, because they couldn't, their god of Geb could not take that off of them. So they were in an impure state, and it would hinder their ability to minister on behalf of the people, because they couldn't do that when they were in an impure condition. So this speaks to the religious leaders and the priests, and the fact that God will bring judgment upon those who think they're in a position of standing before the people and pretending that they are something that they're not. The magicians were unable to duplicate this miracle, and they finally went to Pharaoh and said, well, we can't do this one. We can't keep up with what Moses and Pharaoh are doing this time. This is definitely the finger of God. Now, it's not that they were necessarily giving the God of Israel credit for that, but they were admitting that there was something supernatural going on here that was beyond their capacity. And so Pharaoh, he still was pretty unmoved at this point. He wasn't inclined to let the people go, let the Israelites go at this point. He had been affected by these first three plagues, but probably not in the same way that most of the people of the land were affected. So he kind of just withdrew into his palace and wasn't going to be bothered by this. So that's the first three plagues. They were severe in one sense. They affected the Israelites as well as the Egyptians. The Israelites did go through these first three plagues. But as we move on, we're going to see that the Israelites become unaffected by future plagues. But we'll look at that next time we get together, when we look at the second set of three plagues. So in closing, I just wanted to summarize and say that God comes and he brings judgment upon a land. He's bringing judgment upon the gods of the Egyptians. And he allows the Egyptians, and in this case for the first three, even the Israelites, to experience a portion of his judgment not because he wants to punish, but because he wants people to turn to him. He wants us to stop looking at externals to deliver us from bad situations. He wants us to turn our attention fully to him. And he wants us to be brought in to his protection, his safety, and knowing him more deeply. Ultimately, he wants us to be able to receive the forgiveness that Jesus died on the cross to give us. And so even when we look at what's going on today and we look at the fact that people are going through hardships, deaths do occur. That is not God's intention. Deaths occur because there is sin in the world. God does not intend for people to die. He wants to bring people to him, and he wants to bring healing and wholeness. And so he uses the least severe means that he can to get the greatest number of people to turn to him, to be saved, and to experience peace and wholeness in their hearts. And so as we go through this, not only looking at the plagues of Egypt, but looking at our own situation, looking at the plague that's in our land today, and even for future, we don't know what's yet to come. I just want to reinforce the understanding that God is never about bringing judgment to kill people. He's always bringing judgment so that in light of judgment, he can show his mercy and he can win people to his heart. And so I'll leave you with that. Again, I'm Laura Judah with Time and Destiny. I'm so blessed to be able to share these messages with you, and I pray that through reading the Word and going back to study the story in Exodus, you will see the similarities to what God is doing today, and you will be blessed to trust him more. So I'll see you again. I'll probably be back on Wednesday around 3 o'clock, and we'll look at the next set of plagues. Thanks so much for joining me.